Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the sweet truth about sugar. My name is Jill Bryan, and I am a registered dietitian with PEHP. So today the webinar is going to focus on the different health effects of having too much added sugar in your diet, how you can learn to identify added sugar in your diet, and then I'll review some ways that you can maybe find out if you have too much added sugar, and then how you can reduce that intake. There will be time at the end of the webinar if you have questions. So there is a Q&A box. So please feel free to type your questions in the box, and then I will take time at the end to answer all of your questions. So let's go ahead and get started. So the media often reports, and would like most people to believe, that any sugar you consume is likely poisonous or toxic to your body, and that it would probably be best if you could completely eliminate sugar from your diet to avoid a variety of different health problems. So I've included some of those images on here. So some of the reports from the media are things such as eating too much added sugar may cause cancer, heart disease, can give you acne, may lead to depression, accelerated skin aging, dental problems, and even a decline in your mental health. So the real question is, are any of these health claims really true? Are they supported by research? And is it really necessary that we quit sugar or that we cut it out of our diet completely? So today I want to review some of the research that's available about sugar consumption and how it can affect our health. To start with, I want to cover what exactly is sugar. Maybe when you hear the term sugar, when you see it on a food label, what exactly are we talking about? So in the field of nutrition, when I'm talking about the term sugar, I'm actually referring to a type of carbohydrate. Carbohydrates are found in lots of different food sources and many different foods that we naturally eat. So if you look at this graphic here, you can see there's many different types of carbohydrates. You may be familiar with hearing the term simple carbs or complex carbs, but we generally break carbohydrates down into these three main categories. So the first one they're called monosaccharides. Mono just means one, so they're one sugar molecule. These are the three main types we find in the foods that we eat. So it's glucose, fructose, and galactose. But it's really interesting because you actually don't find these three monosaccharides usually by themselves in a very high amount in food products. Typically, you're going to find them as a disaccharide. Di means two, so it's two sugar molecules linked together. The disaccharides we typically find in the foods we eat are maltose, sucrose, and lactose. So the more complex carbohydrates where we find sugars are the polysaccharides. So poly means many, so typically it's thousands of units of glucose actually linked together to form some of these more complex types of carbohydrates. So if you look at this image here, it lists the monosaccharides again, but then it also shows you how disaccharides are formed. So they're formed by combining our three different monosaccharides together. When you hear the word, or maybe when you use the word sugar, you may be referring to it as something different than when I use that. But usually when someone says, does that have sugar, or I'm going to add sugar into it, you're usually talking about the disaccharide sucrose. So I included an image of what that actually looks like. So sucrose is our white table sugar, and it's formed by combining glucose and fructose together. So the other thing I want you to know about sugar that you probably hear is that sugars can either be naturally occurring in food or they can actually be added into food. So we're talking about naturally occurring sugars. Almost all the carbohydrates you eat naturally, if you look at some of these images, whether it's fruit or vegetables, if they're dairy products and grains, all of those naturally contain sugar. So some of those sugars you're going to find, fructose is naturally found in fruits and some vegetables. So fructose is the sugar that makes fruit sweet. In our dairy products, we're going to find the sugar lactose. And then there are some unprocessed sugars that are found naturally in nature, such as honey, agave, or maple syrup. So typically the problem doesn't come from eating natural sugars in our diet. And the reason for this is because when you eat an apple or if you have a glass of milk, there's other nutrients that you're getting in those food products as well. And we need most of those. There's essential vitamins and minerals, there's fiber. If you're consuming dairy products, you're getting protein and calcium, and all of those have a lot of good healthy benefits for our body. When we're talking about added sugar is going to be any sugar that is added in the preparation of food. So whether it's sugar you're adding at the table, so let's say at breakfast time you're having a bowl of cereal. Sometimes kids like to get white sugar out of the cupboard and put it on their sugar to make it a little sweeter. So that would be considered an added sugar. Maybe you're having oatmeal for breakfast and you put a little brown sugar in it or maybe a little honey. That's considered added sugar as well. When you're baking in the kitchen, if you're adding chocolate chips to a recipe, maybe it's white or brown sugar, corn syrup, all of those are considered added sugars as well. And then in the processing of food, so in large manufacturing processes, a lot of sugar is added to packaged foods as well. So there's lots of different types of sugars that you're going to find, and we're going to review a few food labels today just so you become familiar with this. But what I found is that there's at least 61 different names for sugar that you can find on an ingredient list. And I didn't realize there was that many, which makes it a little bit difficult for consumers to really identify added sugars in their diet. This is an image I found that lists most of the common names for those 61 added sugars. You may be familiar with some of these, and some of these you may not have seen before on an ingredient list. One thing that I think is interesting that I wanted to point out to people, because I get this question quite frequently, is what happens to the different types of carbohydrates or sugars we consume once they enter our body. And what happens is most of the time our body isn't able to distinguish the different types of sugar. So if you're eating a piece of candy or you're having a glass of milk or maybe having a bagel for breakfast, once it's in the body pretty much perceives all sorts of sugar the same way. In order for those carbohydrates to be digested and used by the body for energy, regardless of where that sugar is coming from, it has to be broken down into those basic monosaccharides. So again, it's either going to be glucose, fructose, or galactose to be absorbed into the body. So it doesn't really matter where it's coming from at that point. So I think it's important because our body recognizes it as being all the same, that we need to be mindful of all types of sugars that we're adding into our diet, even if they're unprocessed sources like honey. So a lot of times people will tell me, well, it's okay, I'm not using white sugar, I'm using honey, which is an unprocessed source, so it's got to be healthier. So just be cautious of that, regardless of how much unprocessed sugar you may be using as well. One question you may be wondering is how much added sugar you may actually have in your diet. And unfortunately, most people are consuming more added sugar than they actually realize. So there's been a lot of different studies on this, and they've been able to gather the data on the average consumption of added sugar by the average American. So I want you to take a quick guess, just a mental guess, on how much added sugar you think Americans consume each day in teaspoons. And unfortunately, we're not together, so I can't give out any prizes. But what research shows is that it's anywhere between 17 to 20 teaspoons each day on average. And if we calculate that into calories, it's anywhere between 270 to 350 calories each day coming from this added sugar. So it's important to realize and become aware of how much added sugar you have, because our bodies don't need this added sugar, mostly because it doesn't contribute any additional nutrients to our diet. So we're just getting a lot of empty calories that can contribute potentially to different health problems. So I wanted to kind of put this on a larger scale. So if the average person is consuming 17 to 20 teaspoons each day, what would this look like in a year? So if you multiply that out, it's about 60 to 65 pounds of added sugar each year, or up to 100,000 calories of added sugar, which is a lot when you look at it that way. Wanted to give you another visual. So these are 4-pound bags of sugar that you buy at the grocery store. So if we put these all together, this equals 16 of these 14 bags of sugar which represents the average consumption of added sugar per American in the US, which is a lot if you look at it like this. This graphic shows where most of the added sugar is coming from in our diet. So you can see the largest percentage is coming from beverages. So it's 47%, so almost half of all of our added sugar. Majority of this is coming from soft drinks, fruit drinks, and then our sports or energy drinks. The other largest category you can see in here are snacks and sweets, which is about 31%. And just to kind of give you a visual or an idea, if you were to drink one 12-ounce can of regular soda, is about 8 teaspoons of added sugar or about 130 calories. So if you're drinking a lot of sweetened beverages, or even if you're having one can a day, it can add up really quickly. So you may be thinking it's unlikely you're consuming this much added sugar because maybe you don't use a lot of sugar sweetened beverages, or maybe you don't have a lot of desserts. But unfortunately, a lot of added sugar comes in packaged food products that you may not even be aware has added sugar. So I want to give a couple of examples of products that contain added sugars that you may not have thought of before. You can take a guess on each of these as well. So the first one is yogurt. And as I mentioned, dairy products naturally contain the sugar lactose, but a lot of yogurt companies will add additional sugar to the products to make them a little sweeter. I usually caution people to stay away from yogurts that have fruit on the bottom. It's usually a sugary, syrupy mixture and not a lot of actually fresh fruit. So better option would be to add your own fresh fruit at home. So for this 6-ounce container of yogurt, you're getting 11 grams of added sugar, which comes out to be about 2.5 teaspoons. For the barbecue sauce, the serving size on the container is 2 tablespoons. In those 2 tablespoons, you're getting 16 grams of added sugar, or about 4 teaspoons. So if you look at this and calculate it out, you can see over half of what you're consuming is just straight added sugar in the barbecue sauce. So other condiments such as ketchup has a lot of added sugar, your honey mustard, teriyaki sauces. So be careful with condiments, maybe look and see, because they do all contain a lot of added sugar. The other one most people aren't aware of is spaghetti sauce. So you would think spaghetti sauce is pretty healthy, but a lot of companies will add sugar to it. So in a half a cup serving of this spaghetti sauce, you're getting 12 grams of added sugar, which is about 3 teaspoons. So if you look at these, if you were to have maybe a serving of yogurt in the morning, maybe some barbecue sauce with chicken you were having for lunch, maybe you had spaghetti for dinner, you could see just these 3 products would add up to a lot of added sugar really quickly. So next I want to spend a little bit of time going over the research and what research is showing as far as health effects of having too much added sugar in our diet. So just to give a little preface before I start this topic is very highly controversial, and a lot of it is because of how the studies were done, maybe how the media reports on this research, but there is a lot of research on many different areas of health. The problem is how these studies were done. So a lot of the studies are actually animal-based studies. They're not using amounts of sugar that are typically consumed by humans. A lot of the studies actually are looking at if we have people consume large amounts of pure fructose or pure glucose, how does that affect our health? Which is really hard to then extrapolate and say, how does it affect me? Because we don't typically consume sugar in those amounts or in those sources in our diet. So what I'm going to report today and kind of present to you is the research that I found that gives a good overview of many years of research based on human studies that reflect the amount of typical added sugar that we would get in our diet. I also want to point out that it's important to realize that these studies are looking at too much added sugar, and that's where the health problems are coming from. We don't typically see health problems coming from when you eat whole foods with natural sugars. So I don't want you leaving this thinking, well, I'm going to cut out sugar from my fruit or from dairy products, because consuming those types of products is likely going to help reduce your risk for some complications because of some of the other beneficial nutrients we get when we consume whole food products. So the first one I want to talk about is weight gain and obesity. So there is a lot of research in this area, but the question is often asked, does consuming added sugar lead to weight gain? And if it does, is the weight gain coming because of maybe too many calories in the diet as a result of too much added sugar, or is it because of some unique property that the sugar possesses? So some of the research that's done on this is looking to see, is added sugar handled differently in the body, regardless of how many calories are being consumed, and is that unique property of the sugar what results in the weight gain? So when you look at the overall research on this topic, they found that it's more likely that overconsumption of these types of calories is going to lead to weight gain instead of some unique property of how the sugars are being metabolized in the body. So some of the reasons you may be wondering, well, why would it be getting too many calories from this? And there's several reasons for this. So one reason is when people maybe are not feeling great, maybe they're depressed, or they're lonely, sometimes we'll turn to treats or sugary items because they help us feel good. And that's because when they're digested in the body, they release dopamine and it gives us this good feeling. And so we turn to those types of products to help with some emotions we may be experiencing. If you're eating too many added sugars, maybe they're replacing fruits and vegetables in your diet, which typically are a little bit lower in calories. So too many added sugars may result in too many overall calories. The other thing that research shows is that when you eat a lot of sweet foods, you actually end up craving more sweet food. So it kind of is this continual cycle. So you may be over consuming and always have that craving to be eating something sweet. Overall, I think this was a good statement on kind of the overall research in this area. This was a doctor that works at Johns Hopkins University, said, I don't think we have enough evidence yet to suggest that sugar is the reason for the obesity epidemic, but there is enough evidence to say that elevated sugar consumption is an important contributor to weight gain. So the idea here is that it's not that we can't have added sugar, but that too much added sugar is going to lead to too many calories for a lot of people. That's going to result in weight gain and possibly becoming obese. So how sugar affects heart health is not completely understood, but it does appear to have several indirect health connections. Some of the health connections that increases our risk for cardiovascular disease include being overweight, having high blood pressure, and having high cholesterol. And all of these, based on research, can indirectly be linked to high intakes of sugar consumption. So I just talked about how excess consumption of calories from added sugar can lead to weight gain, but sugar also has an adverse effect on our cholesterol and triglyceride levels. So when you consume large amount of simple sugars like refined grains, such as maybe white bread or white rice, or you eat a lot of added sugar, that sugar is broken down and processed in our liver. And if there's too much of those simple sugars, that increases your triglycerides. And we do know that high triglycerides is a risk factor for heart disease. Research in this area suggests keeping your total simple sugars less than 20% of total calories to help prevent an elevation in your triglyceride levels. For some people, when you're consuming some desserts, they're also going to include saturated fat. So if you think of candy bars, excuse me, or puddings, or maybe some desserts that have chocolate in there, you're also getting saturated fat. If you have too much saturated fat in your diet, that can increase your LDL cholesterol or your unhealthy cholesterol, which is another risk factor for cardiovascular disease as well. So I wanted to point out one specific study in this area. So there was a large study done that was published in 2014 that found an association between a high sugary diet and a greater risk from dying from heart disease. So this was a study that was done over the course of 15 years. And the study showed that people who were consuming between 17 to up to 21% of their calories from added sugar had a 38% higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease compared with those people who consumed 8% of their calories from added sugar. So if you look at this as a whole, it doesn't really appear that the sugar consumption, as long as it's within a normal range, is going to increase your risk for cardiovascular disease. But it's when you get into these higher percentages that's where that risk is going to come because of some of these other indirect effects. So you might have heard, and I've had this question, I've actually heard this statement many times throughout my career, is that does eating too much sugar cause diabetes? So is this really true? You may have heard this before as well. So reviewing the research available on this topic shows that added sugar is not a direct cause of type 2 diabetes. The problem mostly comes from some of these indirect effects. Some of the research is actually looking at high levels of fructose, again, which we don't get in high amounts in our diet alone. But if you do have high levels of fructose, that is a higher risk factor. But the biggest area comes from the risk factor of too many calories from added sugars, which leads to obesity. Obesity is a very high risk factor for someone developing diabetes. So again, looking at the overall research, keeping added sugars in a recommended range is fine. Eating a little bit of sugar long-term over your life is not going to directly cause you to develop diabetes. The last health effect I wanted to review is the relationship with cancer. And sometimes you'll see these reports or these questions in the media asking, does sugar cause cancer? Does eating sugar feed cancer and cause it to grow faster? But are there really any claims to support some of these statements or questions that are being asked? So reviewing the research, many experts from the American Cancer Society and the National Cancer Institute don't think sugar causes cancer based on the research that's currently available. Again, here the biggest risk factor comes from excess weight. We do know if you're obese, if you're carrying too much weight, that is a direct risk factor for a variety of different types of cancer. So again, here I think the goal here is to keep added sugars and all sugars in a moderate recommended intake range. Make sure that the added sugars are not replacing fruits and vegetables in our diet. Vegetables and fruits contain a lot of protective nutrients that can help lower your risk against cancer, and they can also help keep your calorie levels where they should be instead of getting too many calories from added sugars, which can increase your weight overall. So again, no direct association here, but again, there are many indirect links based on some of the other risk factors and excluding some of these other healthy nutrients from your diet. If we know consuming too much added sugar can indirectly be linked to some of these various health conditions, how much is actually safe to consume? And there are several different recommendations for how much added sugar is okay in the diet. There's about 4 or 5 different organizations that have recommendations. And I'm just going to give you 2 recommendations from larger organizations. So the first one is from the American Heart Association, and their recommendations are based on amounts that they feel is adequate to help reduce your risk for heart disease based on research currently available. So if you look at these are the American Heart Association recommendations. For men, they should be getting no more than 9 teaspoons of added sugar each day, and for women and children, the recommendation is less than 6 teaspoons. The other large organization is the 2015 to 2020 Dietary Guidelines for Americans. Their recommendation is to limit calories from added sugars to no more than 10% of what you consume each day. So an example of this, if you have a 2,000 calorie diet, this would be 200 calories or about 12 teaspoons each day. So you can see this recommendation is a little bit higher than the recommendation given from the American Heart Association. So again, if you remember the example of the regular soda, so remember a can of soda has between 8 to 10 teaspoons of added sugar. So you're already at the maximum level of added sugar if you're doing that, if you're consuming those regular added sugars from soda on a regular basis. So now that you know some of the recommendations for added sugar and some of the potential health risks, What are some practical ways that you can lower added sugar in your diet? So the first recommendation I want to cover, I think will probably help you the most, and that is to learn how to read food labels and become aware of the amount of sugar, added sugar in the food you're actually consuming. So if you're at home or if you're at work in your office, if you have a packaged food item close by, I would just recommend using that as we review this so you can actually look at food labels you have and be familiar with how to use them. So as of January 1st of this year, the FDA has now required all food labels to be using this new label that I have here on the screen. It's going to make it much easier for you to identify added sugars in the food products that you're purchasing that have a food label on them. So if you look on the left-hand side here at the original label, you can see under total carbohydrates, there was only one line for sugars. So that included all sugars, both naturally occurring sugars and added sugars in a food product. The new label, if you look under that same section, lists total sugars, and then underneath that includes now a line specifically for added sugars, which makes it really easy to see where the sugars are coming from if they're natural or added. And I really like this because now when you're at the grocery store, maybe you're looking to see two comparable items. Maybe you're going to pick out a spaghetti sauce. Now that you know they have added sugar, you can turn them over, put the label side by side, and pick one that is going to have less added sugar in that so you can pick a healthier option. The best way to use this, which I usually teach people on how to do this, is the first place to start is to look at the nutrition facts at the top where it lists the serving size and determine if that's how much you're actually going to consume of that product. Sometimes we eat 2 or 3 servings, but then we look down at some of the other ingredients and we don't change those. So if you were going to eat 2/3 of a cup of whatever this product was, you can go down to the added sugars and you can see this product has 10 grams of added sugar. If you were going to consume 2 servings of this, you would just multiply that and you would have 20 grams of added sugar. A lot of times it's a little confusing to people because the sugars are listed in grams, which isn't a measurement we use a lot, that we're not familiar with. So I just want to teach you how to calculate what the grams looks like in teaspoons. So it's very simple. You just have to remember one number. So for every 4 grams of sugar in a product, that is equal to 1 teaspoon. So if we look at this example I have on here, 10 grams of added sugar divided by 4 grams would result in it showing 2.5 teaspoons for this product. So again, if you're consuming 2 servings, simply multiply that by 2 and you'd have 5 teaspoons. I didn't put this on the slide, but if you're wanting to know how that calculates into calories, instead of dividing it, you're simply going to multiply it by 4. So every 1 gram of sugar provides 4 calories. So in this example here, I would take the 10 grams of added sugar, multiply that by 4, which would give me 40 calories of added sugar in this food product. So the other thing I want you to learn how to do is to look at the ingredient list, which should be very close to the nutrition facts panel. And the ingredient list can give you a lot of really quick, great information, even if you weren't looking at the ingredient list or the nutrition facts panel. So I want you to just take a quick second here and look through this ingredient list and see how many different added sugars you can identify on this list. So I'll give you just a minute to see how many you can find. And as you can see in here, there's probably many terms that you don't know what they are. And just to let you know, this is actually the ingredient list off of one of the types of Girl Scout cookies. So I've went through and highlighted the different types of sugar in here. So you can see I've highlighted 7 different types. The sweetened condensed milk has the sugar in it. And then I also highlighted the sorbitol, which is a sugar alcohol, and glycerin, which is kind of a derivative of sugar as well. But when you're looking at an ingredient list, one of the quick tips I would give is to look for anything that ends in the word OSE, O-S-E. If you look back at here, one of the ingredients was dextrose, and any of those are a simple way to identify sugar. You can see some of the other more common types. High fructose corn syrup is frequently used. Cane sugar, syrup, honey, even fruit juice concentrates are considered added sugars as well. The other thing that's important to know is that all of the ingredients are listed in this ingredient list in descending order by weight. So again, if we go back and look, the very first ingredient in these cookies is sugar. So I know in comparison to everything else in here, there is more sugar by weight than any other product. And that would help me quickly identify that maybe I should pick something else because I know there's a lot of added sugar in here. Sometimes manufacturers, I think, try to be a little deceiving in their food products. So instead of just using one type of sugar, they will use a lot of different types of sugar, break them into smaller amounts so they appear further down on the ingredient list, which I think can be a little bit deceiving to people. So I just wanted to show you a few examples if you were to compare a similar food item side by side and how looking at the ingredient list would be able to help you reduce your added sugars. So just some different examples. I'm not going to go through each of these, but you can look and see that just by picking maybe a different spaghetti sauce, you could easily reduce the sugar by 2 teaspoons per serving. With cereals, a lot of times I recommend that people buy unsweetened, like the Cheerios. Buy that if you need a little bit of sweetness to it. Add your own sugar, which is going to often result in less sugar, or simply add fruit, which would be a better source as well. So the other big way to reduce sugar, added sugar, is when you're baking. And there's lots of suggestions for this. So I've listed some of these on here. It's really not possible to eliminate all of the sugar when you're baking because sugar has a lot of functions in food preparation. So it adds flavor, texture, volume. Sugar attracts water, so it keeps things moist. If you cut out too much sugar, your cookies are going to be dry and crumbly and not going to last very long. They also help in the coloring. So when you're baking cookies, you can see they get that nice brown, which is kind of a chemical reaction that occurs with the sugar. So these are different ways you can reduce sugar when you're baking. Many of you may have tried some of these before. I just wanted to point out one, probably the simplest one that most people don't know, is that you can simply reduce the amount of sugar in a recipe such as cakes, pies, or cookies by 1/4 to 1/3 without it really changing the overall end result when you're baking. So if you're a little bit weary to try this, maybe start by reducing it by 10% and see how the product turns out, and then you can keep reducing it a little bit more. Adding fruit, mashed or pureed instead of sugar is a great way to do that. Unsweetened dried fruit, so maybe adding some raisins or apricots instead of chocolate chips is a great way. And then increasing the amount of spices also can add some sweetness if sugar is reduced a little bit. Food labels also have claims, so you may have seen some of these food claims on products at the grocery store and wonder what they meant. These are the 3 allowed claims. So if it says reduce or less sugar, it means at least 25% less sugar than the regular product. So you can see that here on the Capri Sun package. If it's labeled sugar-free, that means less than 0.5 grams of sugar per serving. So there is still a little bit of sugar in the product. And then if it says no added sugar, you can see that here on the apple juice and the ketchup container, is that no sugar was added during the manufacturing process. So these are additional ways when you're just looking at packaging to spot ways to reduce added sugar as well. So here's some other simple tips. I'm not going to go through all of these as well. I will point out that if you do find you're drinking a lot of sweetened beverages, that a simple way to reduce that would be to maybe balance out with the amount of water you're consuming. You can still have a little bit of it, but maybe slowly reducing your sweetened beverages would be a quick, easy way to do that. And then maybe opting for fresh fruit instead of dessert on a more consistent basis. I think it's still fine to have dessert, but just maybe not all the time every day. I just wanted to point out sugar substitutes. I'm asked about these quite frequently as well. So the FDA has actually approved 8 sugar substitutes to be used right now. And my recommendation for these based on research is to use them in moderation still. They don't provide any calories, so you're not getting added sugar from them. But based on research, they show they're safe to be used in moderate amounts. One concern with the sugars is that they are very, very sweet. So sometimes they're going to cause you to continue to crave sweet products. So if you can resist that temptation, then it's not going to be as much of a problem. Um, as far as which one's healthier than the other, I think it's a preference based on taste and how you're going to be using them. Some of them work well if you're substituting white table sugar when you're baking compared to other ones. So I would say just do a little bit of research, maybe try a few of them depending on what you're going to be using. But again, use them in moderation and still not try and completely replace them so you can add a lot of sweet things still in your diet. So just in summary, I hope you've realized that it's not necessary to completely eliminate added sugar from your diet. I think it's more important to determine how can you still include some added sugar and still have your diet balanced overall. I think the great way to do this is look at the recommendation, set a recommendation for yourself that you feel is appropriate, then start to look at food labels, see where added sugars are coming from, and then maybe pick a couple of the recommendations I pointed out that you can work on that will help lower overall added sugar intake in your diet. So thank you for joining me today for the webinar. I will stay on if anyone has a few questions. One of the questions I'm seeing here is if you'll be able to get a copy of this presentation. And yes, we'll be posting this on the PEHP website under the wellness section. So you can view this webinar again at a later time. So I'm just going to read through some of these questions. So one of the questions is, why do you consider just the added sugar and not the total sugars? So the total sugars are going to contain the natural sugars as well. So usually I feel like it's more important to be limiting the added sugars specifically, mostly because that's where some of these health concerns are coming from. The total sugars, especially if you're consuming like a whole grain, you're going to have a lot of total sugars there. They're the more complex type of sugars. There's going to be fiber in there as well. So that's why I typically tell people to look at added sugars and specifically for this presentation. So someone asked about the sugar substitute, so I covered that. So with the packaging, why does it state no added sugar? That does not mean that there is no sugar in the product, such as ketchup. So that is true. So with ketchup, if you look at it, you're still going to have some sugars in there, but the sugars that are in there are the sugars that are naturally occurring from the tomatoes. So instead of adding a lot of corn syrup or other things to the ketchup to make them sweeter, it's just the sugars that are naturally found in the ingredients that are being used. So that is a great question. A lot of times I think when people see some of those food claims, they assume it says no sugar added, so it's probably really healthy. I can eat more of it, but that's not really the purpose of some of those food claims. So sugar-free doesn't mean it has artificial sweeteners, so that's not necessarily true. No, sometimes things that are naturally sugar-free will still have some of those claims. I think so people will see them and want to purchase them. Sometimes sugar-free does mean that they do have artificial sweeteners. They can use that claim because it doesn't contain sugar, even though it does have artificial sweeteners in there. So hopefully that answered the question there. So does anyone have any other questions? I hope everyone's doing well at home. I know some people have made comments that if you've been working from home, you're closer to the kitchen. A lot of times we're eating more of these sugary sweets right now than maybe we should be. So hopefully this will give you some ideas on maybe how to cut back and include healthy amounts of added sugar so we're not increasing our health risk for some of these chronic conditions. So thank you everyone again. We'll be posting this webinar, so if you want to share it with your organizations or share it with someone or listen to it again, it will be available in the future. I have also listed references, so if you want to read more about some of these different topics, once this is posted, you can go in and visit some of these references as well. So thank you, everyone, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.